The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil echoed through the streets of every medieval town, a sound so familiar it blended into the background of daily life. But what if I told you that this steady beat was the hidden pulse of an entire era? Behind every castle's towering walls, every knight's gleaming armor, and every farmer's plow cutting through the earth, there was one figure whose hands shaped the destiny of the Middle Ages, the blacksmith. These master craftsmen didn't just bend metal, they bent history itself. Picture the glow of the forge, the hiss of molten steel, and the sweat-streaked face of a smith working late into the night. In that fiery crucible, the tools of peace and the weapons of war were born side by side, each one a testament to a skill that held empires together. Think about the last time you held something sturdy and well-made, a tool, a piece of hardware, maybe even a kitchen knife. Now imagine living in a world where everything from your door hinges to your dinner utensils depended on the same hands that forged swords for kings. Blacksmiths were the ultimate problem solvers, the original engineers of their time. Without them, castles would have crumbled, armies would have faltered, and daily life would have ground to a halt. Their workshops were medieval innovation hubs, places where raw ore transformed into the very foundations of power. But here's what's even more fascinating: their influence went far beyond the physical. The blacksmith's craft shaped social hierarchies, fueled economies, and even inspired legends like the mythical figure of Whale and the Smith, whose story was told from Scandinavia to England. So why have these pivotal figures faded into the background of history? Perhaps because their work was so essential it became invisible, like the nails holding together a wooden beam. But today, we're pulling back the curtain on their extraordinary legacy. Over the next few minutes, we'll travel back to a time when the ring of steel meant more than just noise. It was the sound of progress. You'll discover how blacksmiths armed knights for the Crusades, crafted the locks that secured Europe's greatest treasures, and even played a surprising role in the rise of cities. By the end, you'll never look at a simple iron hinge or a suit of armor the same way again. Because when you understand the blacksmith, you understand the beating heart of the medieval world. So grab your virtual apron. We're stepping into the heat and light of the forge to uncover a story written in fire and iron. The blacksmith's forge wasn't just a workshop, it was a living, breathing center of medieval life. Step inside one, and you'd find a world of fire and ingenuity, where raw iron met human skill in a dance that kept entire communities running. Every morning began the same way, the smith stoking the flames, the bellows groaning as they pumped air into the coals, and the first sparks flying as metal met hammer. But this wasn't just about crafting objects, it was about solving problems. A farmer might arrive with a broken plowshare, a knight needing his sword reforged, or a housewife with a bent cooking pot, each one relying on the smith's expertise to mend what was essential to their lives. What made the forge truly remarkable was its role as an early hub of technology. Blacksmiths were the original recyclers, melting down old tools and scrap metal to create something new. They didn't just follow patterns, they experimented, adapting designs to make stronger plows, sharper axes, and more durable hinges. Think of it like a medieval version of a tech startup, where every innovation had immediate real-world impact. When a smith discovered a better way to temper steel, entire villages benefited. When they perfected a new nail design, buildings stood taller and longer. Their work rippled outward, shaping agriculture, construction, and even trade. But the forge was also a social hub, a place where news traveled as fast as the sparks flying from the anvil. While waiting for repairs, villagers exchanged gossip, debated local disputes, and sometimes even settled deals over the clang of metal. The smithy was where a lord might rub shoulders with a farmer, both united by their need for the smith's craft. This daily interaction gave blacksmiths something rare in the rigid medieval hierarchy: influence. They weren't just artisans, they were trusted figures, weaving together the fabric of their communities with every strike of their hammers. And let's not forget the sheer spectacle of their work. Imagine the glow of molten metal in a dim workshop, the smell of burning coal mixing with sweat, the rhythmic pounding echoing like a heartbeat. It's no wonder blacksmiths became figures of legend. Their forges seemed almost magical, turning rough ore into objects of strength and beauty. Even the language of their craft seeped into everyday speech. Phrases like "strike while the iron is hot" or "too many irons in the fire" originated in these smoky workshops, proof of how deeply their world touched medieval minds. Yet for all their importance, blacksmiths rarely worked alone. Apprentices, often young boys starting as early as 7 or 8, learned the trade through years of grueling labor, fetching water, pumping bellows, and gradually handling simpler tasks under the watchful eye of their master. This apprenticeship system wasn't just about passing down skills. It shaped medieval childhood, education, and even social mobility. A talented apprentice might one day open his own forge, rising from poverty to prosperity through sheer craftsmanship. The next time you hear the distant ring of a hammer or feel the weight of a well-made tool, remember this: centuries ago, that same sound and sensation shaped civilizations. From the humblest nail to the grandest cathedral gate, the blacksmith's forge built the medieval world one piece at a time. But their true power didn't stop at the workshop door. It extended into the halls of kings and the battlefields where empires rose and fell. And that's where our story turns next. In a world where your birth usually determined your destiny, blacksmiths held a rare and remarkable position. They could hammer their way up the social ladder. While most peasants were tied to the land, bound by the rigid feudal system, the blacksmith's anvil became a ticket to something greater. Lords and kings might have looked down on common laborers, but they couldn't ignore the person who kept their armies armed, their castles secure, and their economies moving. A skilled smith wasn't just another face in the crowd. They were a strategic asset, and that gave them leverage most commoners could only dream of. Take tax exemptions, for example. In many medieval towns, blacksmiths were granted freedom from certain taxes, not out of charity, but because their work was seen as essential to the community's survival. Imagine being the only person in your village who didn't have to hand over a portion of your earnings to the local lord. That kind of privilege was almost unheard of for someone born outside the nobility. But it didn't stop there. Some smiths were given special plots of land, exemptions from military service, or even the right to collect fees for their services directly, bypassing the usual middlemen. These weren't just perks, they were signs of respect, acknowledgements that the blacksmith's craft was worth more than raw muscle. It was a form of intelligence, artistry, and even power. And then there were the smiths who climbed even higher. In royal courts, master armorers and weaponsmiths weren't just laborers, they were trusted advisors. Kings relied on their expertise to decide everything from battlefield strategies to castle defenses. A well-made sword could mean the difference between victory and defeat, and a poorly forged gate hinge could leave a fortress vulnerable. So when rulers needed counsel on military technology or infrastructure, they didn't turn to nobles, they turned to the people who understood metal. Some blacksmiths became so indispensable that they were granted titles, lands, or permanent positions in royal workshops. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this social climb was how it blurred the lines of medieval hierarchy. In the forge, a blacksmith might interact with everyone from lowly farmers to high-ranking knights, creating a web of connections that crossed class boundaries. They weren't quite nobility, but they weren't ordinary commoners either. They occupied a unique middle ground respected by both sides. This rare position allowed them to influence decisions in ways most peasants couldn't. A smith might persuade a lord to invest in better farming tools or advise a merchant on trade routes for iron supplies. Their voice carried weight precisely because they weren't tied to one social group. Yet this rise wasn't without its tensions. Not everyone was happy to see a blacksmith gain influence. Some nobles resented the special treatment given to mere craftsmen, while jealous rivals might spread rumors about smiths dabbling in forbidden knowledge or even magic. After all, turning raw ore into gleaming steel must have seemed like alchemy to the uninitiated. But despite the whispers, blacksmiths kept climbing because in the end, no one could deny their value. So the next time you picture a medieval blacksmith, don't just see a soot-covered laborer. See a savvy operator, a bridge between worlds, a person whose skill with fire and iron could reshape their entire future. Their story isn't just about metal, it's about how talent and necessity could bend the rules of an otherwise rigid society. And as we're about to discover, their creations didn't just change individual lives, they transformed kingdoms. The sword wasn't just steel, it was a statement. When a medieval warrior drew his blade, he wasn't just holding a weapon. He was gripping centuries of craftsmanship, political power, and personal identity. And behind every legendary sword, from the Viking Ulfbert to the elegant arming swords of knights, stood a blacksmith whose skill could tilt the balance of battles. These weren't mere tools, they were masterpieces of engineering, forged through techniques so advanced they bordered on artistry. Take pattern welding, where rods of iron and steel were twisted, folded, and hammered together hundreds of times, creating a blade with the flexibility to withstand brutal combat yet sharp enough to slice through leather and mail. The result, swords that became heirlooms passed down generations, their very presence on the battlefield enough to demoralize enemies. But the blacksmith's genius didn't stop at swords. Consider the evolution of armor, a revolution in personal protection that transformed warfare itself. Early chainmail, painstakingly crafted from thousands of interlocking rings, could deflect slashing blows, but it was the later plate armor that turned knights into near-impervious tanks. A well-fitted suit wasn't just metal. It was a second skin, articulated at the joints to allow fluid movement while shielding vital organs. Smiths didn't just hammer sheets of steel, they sculpted them, tailoring each piece to its wearer's body. The difference between life and death often came down to the precision of a blacksmith's measurements. A gap of just half an inch could leave a fatal weak spot. And when entire armies began adopting standardized armor, smiths became the unsung strategists of medieval warfare, their workshops functioning like arms factories centuries before industrialization. Yet the true measure of their impact lies in the stories. The Ulfbert swords, stamped with their maker's name, were so superior they became the stuff of legend. Some even believed they were forged with mythical, crucible steel from far-off lands. In an era when most craftsmen toiled anonymously, these blades carried their creators' identities across battlefields, a rare immortality for commoners. And when smiths experimented with new alloys or quenching techniques, the ripple effects were immediate. A sharper sword edge could penetrate thicker shields. A lighter helmet meant a knight could fight longer without exhaustion. These weren't incremental improvements. They were game changers that dictated who lived, who conquered, and who faded into history. But beyond the battlefield, these weapons carried deeper meanings. A lord's sword often bore intricate engravings or embedded relics, transforming it from a tool of war into a sacred object. Smiths didn't just forge metal, They wove symbolism into steel, crafting blades that represented oaths, lineage, or divine favor. The ritual of gifting a sword could bind vassals to lords or seal alliances between kingdoms. In a world where power was performative, the blacksmith's creations were the ultimate props, visible, visceral proof of authority. And then there's the darker side, the arms race they unknowingly fueled. As smiths honed their skills, weapons grew deadlier, armor stronger, and wars bloodier. The same ingenuity that protected knights also forced the development of crossbows powerful enough to pierce plate armor, or polearms designed to unhorse them. It was a cycle of innovation and retaliation, with blacksmiths at its core, not as warmongers, but as problem solvers responding to the demands of their time. Their legacy isn't just in the artifacts they left behind, but in how they shaped the very nature of conflict. Yet for all their technical prowess, medieval smiths understood something modern engineers often forget: metal has a soul. The best weapons weren't just functional, they carried the smith's intent, the warrior's spirit, and the culture's values. That's why, even today, these objects captivate us not just as relics of war, but as expressions of human ingenuity. And as we're about to discover, that spiritual dimension wasn't incidental. It was woven into every strike of the hammer, every fold of the steel, every ritual that transformed raw ore into something transcendent. Fire wasn't just a tool for the medieval blacksmith. It was a sacred force, a bridge between the earthly and the divine. In an age where people believed the elements held spiritual power, the smith's ability to command flames and shape metal seemed almost supernatural. No wonder their workshops became places of awe, where the ordinary met the extraordinary with every strike of the hammer. Across Europe, folklore whispered of smiths with otherworldly knowledge like Whale and the Smith, the legendary figure who could craft wings to escape captivity or forge unbreakable swords gifted by the gods themselves. These weren't just stories, they were reflections of a deeper truth. Blacksmiths were the keepers of secrets that felt like magic. Consider the alchemical nature of their craft. To the medieval mind, transforming rough ore into gleaming steel mirrored the mysteries of creation itself. The smith's forge became a kind of sacred laboratory, where fire purified base materials, just as spiritual trials purified the soul. Even the tools carried symbolic weight: the anvil, immovable as a mountain, the hammer striking with the force of destiny, the tongs gripping red-hot metal like a deity holding lightning. Small wonder that in some traditions, blacksmiths doubled as village mystics, called upon to bless weapons, craft protective amulets, or even perform simple rituals to ward off evil. Their hands didn't just shape metal, they shaped fate. This reverence bled into everyday life. Horseshoes, still hung today for luck, originated from the belief that a smith's craftsmanship could repel dark forces. In Scandinavia, it was said that a blacksmith's touch could heal wounds, while Slavic legends told of smiths who reforged the sun itself to restore light to the world. Even the Christian Church acknowledged their spiritual role, with Saint Eligius, a master goldsmith, becoming the patron saint of metalworkers. The message was clear: those who mastered fire and metal held a sliver of the divine. Yet their most enduring legacy wasn't mystical, it was economic. The same skills that inspired legends also built the foundations of medieval commerce. Smiths were among the first true specialists in a subsistence economy, creating goods so essential that villages willingly traded food, wool, or labor in exchange. Their forges became early centers of trade, where raw materials from distant mines met local demand. Over time, this barter system evolved into something revolutionary: a money-based economy. As smiths produced surplus tools, those goods could be sold at markets, fueling the rise of towns and trade networks. The humble nail, often overlooked, tells this story perfectly standardized sizes meant they could be mass-produced, turning a simple fastener into a commodity that circulated across kingdoms. The blacksmith's dual role as both mystic and merchant reveals a profound truth about the Middle Ages. Progress wasn't just driven by kings or priests, it was hammered out by artisans whose daily work quietly reshaped the world. Their spiritual significance faded with the Enlightenment, but their economic impact only grew, setting the stage for the workshops that would one day become factories. The next time you flip a coin or admire an old iron gate, remember, you're touching the legacy of those who turned fire into fortune. By the 12th century, something revolutionary was taking shape in the smoky back alleys of medieval cities. Blacksmiths weren't just working side by side anymore, they were organizing. What began as informal alliances between craftsmen soon hardened into something far more powerful, the first trade guilds. These weren't mere clubs, they were the birth certificates of modern labor systems. Picture a group of smiths gathering after work, not just to share techniques, but to draft strict rules on everything from the purity of iron used to the number of nails a journeyman could produce in a day. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like simple collaboration, but in reality, they were rewriting the rules of economic life. The genius of these guilds lay in their balance of competition and cooperation. On one hand, they enforced quality standards so rigorous that a shoddy horseshoe could cost a smith his reputation. On the other, they created safety nets, sick funds for injured members, dowries for craftsmen's daughters, even funeral expenses for those who'd spent their lives at the anvil. This wasn't just about fairness, it was about survival. In a world without unions or insurance, the guild became a smith's second family, and their influence rippled outward. When guilds standardized weights for iron bars or set fixed prices for sword blades, they weren't just regulating their trade, they were laying the groundwork for entire market economies. But guilds did something even more profound. They turned skill into currency. Before guilds, knowledge was hoarded like treasure, passed only from parent to child. Now, apprenticeship became a formal ladder, starting as a lowly sweeper, advancing to bellows pumper, then hammer holder, until finally, after 7 grueling years, a young man might present his masterpiece to the guild elders. If deemed worthy, he'd join their ranks. This system didn't just preserve craftsmanship, it democratized it. A peasant's son with talent could rise higher than a nobleman's heir without it. The guild hall's crest above a workshop door didn't just signal quality, it promised opportunity. Cities quickly realized the value of these organized smiths. Town councils offered guilds tax breaks in exchange for maintaining essential services, armoring the militia, repairing city gates, even crafting the iron fittings for public wells. In return, guilds gained political clout, with master smiths sitting alongside merchants and clergy in council chambers. The result, urban centers flourished. Reliable tools meant more productive farms feeding growing populations. Standardized nails and hinges allowed taller, sturdier buildings. And as guilds expanded, from blacksmiths to farriers, armorers to locksmiths, they created interdependent networks of specialists, each fueling the other's success. Yet guilds weren't without their tensions. The same system that nurtured excellence could also stifle innovation. Some became so obsessed with tradition that they resisted new techniques, like the water-powered hammers that threatened hand forging. Others guarded their secrets jealously, leading to bitter rivalries between towns. But even these conflicts drove progress. When one guild refused to adopt a new furnace design, competitors raced to master it first. The legacy of these medieval collectives echoes in places you'd never expect. Modern minimum wage laws, guilds set the first fair pay scales, quality assurance labels. They originated with guild-mandated maker's marks. Even today's trade schools owe their structure to those smoky medieval workshops where skill was measured not by pedigree, but by the work of one's hands. The next time you see a union logo or a handcrafted label, remember, it all started when a group of blacksmiths decided their collective strength could forge a better future for all. While swords and armor capture our imagination, the true measure of a blacksmith's genius lies in the humble objects that transformed daily existence. Take something as simple as a lock. What seems like a basic mechanism today was once a marvel of medieval engineering. Early locksmiths didn't just keep thieves out, they encoded status into metal. A lord's chest might feature intricate ward locks with false keyholes to confuse intruders, while a merchant's strongbox used rotating barrels that only aligned with the correct key's teeth. These weren't just security devices, they were early prototypes of privacy, allowing families to safeguard everything from grain stores to precious manuscripts. And the keys themselves, miniature works of art, often worn as jewelry to signify trust and authority. Then there's the quiet revolution of agricultural tools, innovations that fed empires. Before blacksmiths perfected the heavy plow, farmers struggled with shallow scratches in stubborn northern soils. But with iron-reinforced blades that cut deeper and moldboards that flipped earth rather than just pushing it, fields yielded double or triple the crops. Suddenly, one farmer's labor could feed dozens, freeing others to specialize in trades that built villages into towns. It wasn't just plows either. Iron-tipped hoes, scythes with curved blades for efficient harvesting, and even the humble horseshoe, which allowed draft animals to work longer without injury, all came from the same forges that produced weapons. The blacksmith's anvil, it turns out, was as vital to survival as the farmer's field, but perhaps their most overlooked contribution was in architecture. Next time you walk past an old stone building, look closely. Those iron cramps holding blocks together, the hinges on towering oak doors, even the decorative filigree on cathedral gates were all born in a smith's fire. Medieval builders relied on them for innovations like the carpenter's brace, a reinforced joint that let roofs span wider spaces without collapsing. Without these metal supports, the grand halls and soaring cathedrals we admire today would have been impossible. The reach of these craftsmen extended far beyond Europe's borders. Along the Silk Road, Persian smiths developed wind-powered furnaces that reached temperatures high enough to produce crucible steel, a technique later echoed in Damascus blades. In Japan, the Tatara furnaces layered charcoal and iron sand created the legendary folded steel of samurai swords. And in West Africa, the Benin Kingdom's brass casters used lost wax methods so precise their artworks baffled European traders. What linked these traditions wasn't just skill, but a shared understanding. Mastery of metal meant control over destiny. From the Viking blacksmith who riveted longships for transatlantic voyages to the Indian artisans crafting surgical tools centuries before modern medicine, these innovators proved that civilization wasn't built by kings alone. It was hammered into being, one nail, one plowshare, one ingenious solution at a time. The clang of hammers echoed not just in European villages but across continents, as blacksmiths became unlikely agents of globalization long before the term existed. Picture a Viking trader in 9th century Baghdad, bartering not just amber and furs, but something far more valuable: knowledge. Norse smiths marveled at the intricate Damascene steel of Islamic swords, while Arab metalsmiths studied the surprisingly flexible iron of Scandinavian axes. This wasn't just trade, it was a silent dialogue of techniques, with each culture adapting what worked best. The Vikings layered forging methods designed to prevent brittle weapons in freezing climates, eventually influenced blade making as far south as Spain. Meanwhile, the precision of Persian water-powered trip hammers capable of shaping metal with rhythmic efficiency would later inspire European guilds to mechanize their forges. Asia's contributions were even more transformative. Chinese metallurgists had mastered blast furnace technology by the 4th century, achieving temperatures high enough to produce cast iron on an industrial scale. When these innovations trickled westward through the Silk Road, they revolutionized European metalwork. Suddenly, smiths could mass-produce everything from cooking pots to cannonballs, shifting entire economies. The Japanese Tatara furnace, with its unique alternating layers of iron sand and charcoal, created swords so sharp they could slice through European armor, a fact that shocked Portuguese traders when they first witnessed it. These weren't isolated advances, they were strands in a global web of innovation, where Samarkand smiths borrowed Korean bellows designs and Indian workshops adopted Central Asian quenching techniques. But the most fascinating exchanges happened in frontier zones, places like Islamic Spain or the Rus trading posts, where Christian, Muslim, and pagan smiths worked shoulder to shoulder. In Constantinople's armories, Greek fire technicians collaborated with Armenian ironworkers to create siege weapons that blended Byzantine chemistry with Caucasian metallurgy. The result, war machines unlike anything the world had seen. Even everyday objects carried these cultural fusions. A simple knife excavated in Sweden might have a Frankish blade pattern, a Saxon hilt design, and Russian silver inlay, 3 continents represented in a single tool. This cross-pollination went beyond technology. It shaped identities. When Crusaders encountered the superior steel of Saladin's armies, they didn't just adopt the techniques, they spun legends about Saracen sorcery to explain its brilliance. Conversely, Mongolian blacksmiths captured during Genghis Khan's westward expansion were spared execution for their skills, eventually teaching European prisoners their advanced bow laminating methods. Metal became a universal language, one that could bridge divides even when politics or religion couldn't. Yet this interconnected world had a shadow side, one where the blacksmith's indispensable role made them targets as much as treasures. The same knowledge that earned them respect could also chain them to forced labor in enemy territories or mark them for assassination during wartime. Their forges, so vital to daily life, became strategic military assets to be seized or destroyed. And as we'll see next, that delicate balance between power and vulnerability would define some of the darkest chapters in their history. War reshaped the blacksmith's forge from a place of craft into a battlefield of its own. When armies marched, smiths became the most coveted and most vulnerable targets. Picture a besieged castle, its walls shaking under catapult blows, while inside, a blacksmith works feverishly to repair shattered armor and broken arrowheads. His anvil's ring isn't just productivity, it's desperation. Every hammer strike counts when the enemy's battering ram pounds at the gates, but the real danger came after the fighting ended. Victorious armies often rounded up local smiths first, dragging them in chains to enemy lands to arm their next conquest. For these craftsmen, survival meant a cruel choice: forge weapons for their captors or face torture. Some resisted subtly, crafting blades with hidden flaws, a sword that might shatter on the third strike, or armor joints that stiffened after rain. Famine brought its own horrors. When crops failed, the blacksmith's iron became currency in a barter economy gone mad. A simple hoe might trade for a week's worth of grain, while families handed down heirlooms to be melted into plowshares. Smiths themselves often starved alongside their neighbors, their forges cold for lack of charcoal as forests were stripped bare for fuel. In monastery records from the Great Famine of the 1400s, scribes noted smiths trading their tools for handfuls of barley, then resorting to eating the leather from their own bellows. Yet even in these depths, their ingenuity persisted. Some repurposed church bells into farming implements, while others salvaged nails from abandoned homes to craft fishhooks. turning rivers into lifelines. Amid these struggles, one group defied expectations entirely: women at the anvil. While most medieval smithies were male domains, exceptions flicker through history like sparks in the dark. In York, England, archaeologists uncovered a 9th-century workshop buried under centuries of mud, its tools sized for smaller hands, its grave markers nearby bearing feminine names. Across the Channel, French tax rolls list a handful of widows inheriting their husbands' forges, their signatures bold on guild contracts. These women weren't just keeping the fires lit, they were innovating. A smith in Burgundy patented a new method for chainmail rings in 1322, her design allowing faster repairs on the battlefield. Another in Cologne specialized in delicate surgical tools, her scalpels prized by physicians across the Rhine. Their stories whisper through legal cracks and ledger lines like the Icelandic saga, recounting a shipwrecked blacksmith's daughter who rebuilt her father's trade with salvaged driftwood and bog iron. Or the Welsh poem praising the flame-haired smith queen, whose arrowheads never missed their mark. These weren't anomalies, they were proof that skill trumped gender when survival was at stake. In plague-ravaged towns where half the male population perished, women stepped into vacant workshops, keeping water wheels turning and plows cutting earth. Their legacy, though often erased, reminds us that the medieval world was far more flexible than our stereotypes suggest. So the next time you picture a blacksmith, don't just see the burly arms and soot-streaked beard. See the prisoner forging under duress, the starving artisan trading his last chisel for bread, the widow bending over glowing metal to feed her children. Their hammers didn't just shape iron, they shaped history, one resilient blow at a time. Forging equality, the overlooked women of the anvil, though rare female blacksmiths like Elena of Aquitaine's armorer left their mark. Monasteries often trained nuns in metalwork for liturgical art. Here we reclaim their stories from the shadows of history. Next, we'll decode the secret language of smiths. History books often paint the medieval forge as an exclusively male domain, a world of sweat, soot, and brute strength. But dig deeper, and you'll find women shaping metal at every level of society, from queens to quiet nuns. Take Elena of Aquitaine's personal armorer, a woman known only as Mahout in court records. While her lordess plotted politics, Mahout's hands turned steel into statements of power, crafting ceremonial swords and intricate chainmail that doubled as diplomatic gifts. Her work wasn't just functional, it was propaganda in physical form, whispering messages of strength to allies and rivals alike. Then there were the unexpected sanctuaries of female metalwork, convents. Behind cloistered walls, nuns mastered the delicate art of liturgical metalcraft, bending gold into reliquaries and silver into chalices. At Essen Abbey in Germany, Sister Guda's workshop produced censers so finely detailed they seemed to breathe, their swirling vines and saintly figures testaments to a spirituality forged in fire. These women didn't just copy men's techniques, they innovated. The nun's touch, as some scribes called it, favored lighter hammers and lower temperature alloys, allowing precision that bulky guild forges often missed. But the most fascinating stories emerge from the margins. In York, excavations revealed a 10th-century workshop buried under centuries of mud, its anvil smaller than standard, its hammer handles worn to fit slender grips. Nearby graves held female remains with telltale signs, enlarged right arm bones healed burns on the palms, even metal filings embedded in tooth enamel. These weren't just helpers fetching water, they were full-fledged smiths, their bodies bearing the same marks as their male counterparts. Why does their absence from the record persist? Partly because guilds rarely admitted women officially, forcing them to work under husbands' or fathers' names. A Bristol tax roll from 1342 lists Johanna, widow of Thomas the Smith, but dig deeper and you'll find neighbors testifying how she'd secretly run the forge for years before his death. Other clues hide in plain sight, like the M stamped on certain medieval keys, long assumed to stand for master, until church ledgers revealed it marked workshops managed by women like Marguerite of Provence, whose lock designs became the gold standard for French cathedrals. Their legacy isn't just in objects, but in cracks they pried open in a rigid system. When plague wiped out half of Europe's male smiths, widows like Krakau's Hedwig inherited client lists and apprentices, proving skill mattered more than gender when survival hung in the balance. Some even leveraged their position, like the anonymous smith behind the Dancing Anvil Tavern in London, where women traders gathered to negotiate iron prices away from guild halls. These weren't exceptions, they were proof that the forge, for all its fiery masculinity, could also be a space of quiet rebellion. Now, listen closely to the next time a hammer strikes metal. Beneath the clang, you might hear another sound, the whisper of history's untold, of women who bent more than just iron. They bent the rules, and as we're about to discover, rules weren't the only thing blacksmiths loved to twist. Every groove in a medieval blade told a story. That shallow channel running down the center of a sword, the fuller, wasn't just there to lighten the weapon. To the smith who forged it, that space was a canvas. Some filled these grooves with twisted iron rods resembling serpents, a nod to Norse legends of the Midgard serpent. Others inlaid them with silver crosses or cryptic runes like Tainlorn, a Frankish charm invoking divine protection in battle. These weren't decorations, they were prayers hammered into steel, meant to guide the warrior's hand as much as the blade's edge. Even the rhythm of a smith's hammer strikes could embed meaning. Some swords bear patterns suggesting the maker's blows followed liturgical chants, turning the forging process into a sacred ritual. Church gates reveal even grander symbolism. The iron hinges of Canterbury Cathedral twist into vine-like tendrils, not just for beauty but to echo Christ's words, "I am the vine, you are the branches." Look closer and you'll spot tiny frogs hidden in the metalwork, medieval symbols of resurrection, tucked between leaves as a visual sermon for illiterate parishioners. In Chartres, the south portal's iron straps form a labyrinth, mirroring the floor design pilgrims walked as penance. Smiths collaborated with monks to encode theology into every curl and rivet, transforming functional hardware into visual scripture. But this symbolic language had a darker side. When smiths etched Sigillum Salomonis, seal of Solomon, onto a knight's dagger, were they invoking divine favor or dabbling in forbidden knowledge? Rumors swirled that certain smiths could bind spirits into metal, explaining why some blades seemed unnaturally sharp or armor suspiciously resilient. A 13th century chronicle from Burgundy tells of a count who executed his armorer, convinced the man had sold his soul to make swords that never dulled. Whether envy or genuine fear drove these accusations, one thing was clear: the blacksmith's mastery of elements made them figures of both reverence and distrust. The most telling symbols, though, weren't in the grand artifacts but in everyday objects. A peasant's cooking pot might bear 3 small dots near the rim, a smith's mark, yes, but also a folk charm against spoilage. Even something as simple as a door latch could carry hidden meaning. Scroll-ended brackets in York copied the shape of Viking protective runes, repurposed by Christian smiths to guard homes. These tiny details reveal a world where metal wasn't just material, it was a language, one that spoke of faith, fear, and the fragile line between artisan and alchemist. As whispers of witchcraft grew louder in the late Middle Ages, that line blurred further. Smiths found themselves caught between two worlds, indispensable enough to escape the worst persecutions, yet mysterious enough to remain suspect. Their ability to tame fire and transmute ore through flux, a process that looked suspiciously like alchemy, left them vulnerable. In one chilling trial record from Normandy, a smith's apprentice testified that his master's forge glowed blue as the Virgin's robe when working with certain alloys, a detail the inquisitors seized upon as proof of heresy. Whether these accounts reflected genuine wonder or calculated defamation, they underscored a truth every medieval smith understood. Their craft walked hand in hand with danger, not just from sparks and splinters, but from the human fear of what they alone could command. Yet perhaps the most poignant symbols lie in what wasn't made. Excavations at abandoned forges sometimes reveal half-finished objects, a sword tang without a blade, a lock mechanism missing its springs. These fragments speak louder than any inscription, reminders that behind every masterpiece were countless experiments, failures, and ideas cut short by war, plague, or persecution. The true language of medieval metalwork wasn't just in what survived, but in what was lost, reforged, or left deliberately incomplete. And as we'll see next, that tension between creation and destruction would define their final chapter in an age of upheaval. The glow of the forge could illuminate a blacksmith's reputation as easily as it lit their workshop, casting them as either miracle workers or menaces, depending on who held the hammer of judgment. In one village, a smith might be hailed as a local saint, his anvil blessed by the parish priest. In the next town over, whispers of witchcraft might swirl around the same calloused hands. This paradox wasn't just superstition, it was a reflection of how deeply their craft unsettled the medieval mind. To transform rock into razor-sharp steel, to command fire that could melt the unyielding, seemed to defy the natural order. Small wonder that some saw their work as divine, while others crossed themselves at the sight of a smith's shadow. Take the curious case of Saint Eligius, the 7th century goldsmith turned bishop. Revered for crafting exquisite reliquaries, his legend grew until churches claimed his tools could heal the sick, a far cry from the smiths later accused of poisoning wells simply by quenching hot metal in water. The difference: proximity to power. Court artisans like Eligius operated under the church's approving gaze, while rural smiths, often the only literate commoners in their villages, became easy targets when crops failed or children fell ill. Their very knowledge, like understanding which ores caused mysterious green fumes when smelted, could be twisted into evidence of sorcery, yet even suspicion couldn't diminish their necessity. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, terrified mobs might burn witch smiths one year, only to beg surviving craftsmen for protective amulets the next. Town records from plague-ridden Marseille show this duality starkly. In 1348, a smith named Henry was fined for unnatural metallurgy, yet by 1350, the same council paid him triple wages to forge iron, plague crosses for every citizen. Communities wavered between reliance and revulsion, needing the smith's skill while fearing what they couldn't comprehend. The tension peaked during the witch trials, where smiths occupied a precarious middle ground. In Sweden, trial transcripts reveal accused witches blaming their supposed powers on the smith's devil-marked tools, while in Germany, inquisitors specifically questioned armorers about blue flames in their furnaces, a natural phenomenon caused by certain alloys, but one that fed fears of hellish pacts. Some smiths leaned into the mystique, like the Burgundian craftsman who charged extra to engrave Solomon's seal on blades, playing on clients' belief in magical protection. Others fought back with cold logic. A London guild petition in 1592 argued that if smiths truly had dark powers, they'd shape gold, not horseshoes. This dance between reverence and distrust left its mark on folklore. Irish tales portrayed smiths as healers who could hammer out illness, while German woodcuts showed them shoeing the devil's cloven hooves, a metaphor for their role as both tamer and tempter. Even the Arthurian legends captured this duality. Merlin the enchanter apprenticed to a smith, while the virtuous Sir Galahad's sword was forged by a hermit smith chanting prayers. The message was clear: fire and iron were neutral forces, their morality shaped by the hands that wielded them. What's often overlooked is how smiths weaponized their ambiguous status. In Normandy, guilds circulated miracle stories about their patron saints to counter witchcraft accusations. Italian armorers deliberately staged dramatic forging rituals for clients, tossing salt into flames to make them flare, or chanting Latin phrases while quenching blades to enhance their reputation as masters of mysteries. The smartest among them understood that in an age of uncertainty, a little awe could be as valuable as skill. This delicate balance between persecution and prestige didn't just shape individual lives, it influenced entire artistic movements. When Renaissance sculptors sought to depict divine creation, they often modeled their workshops after smithies, with God as the ultimate metalsmith. The very word forge became synonymous with creative power, bridging the gap between earthly craft and heavenly inspiration. And as we'll soon discover, that connection between hammer and artistry would ignite some of history's most breathtaking masterpieces. Gothic cathedrals didn't just scrape the sky, they danced on iron. Those soaring arches and intricate stained glass windows we admire today, they'd have collapsed without the hidden artistry of blacksmiths. Picture the skeletal framework of Notre Dame, slender iron bars called armatures, laced through the stone like invisible threads, holding each delicate spire in perfect tension. This wasn't just construction, it was alchemy, turning rigid metal into something almost weightless. And the smiths knew it. Many signed their work with subtle flourishes, twisting reinforcement rods into vine-like curls or hammering joint caps into floral shapes. Even the cathedral's famed rose windows relied on wrought iron spiderwebs to suspend thousands of glass pieces in radiant harmony. The message was clear: divinity needed both the mason's chisel and the smith's fire. But the aesthetic revolution didn't stop at architecture. Open any illuminated manuscript from the period, and you'll find gold leaf glowing on the page, a brilliance made possible by smith-forged tools. Scribes used hammered bronze burnishes, their surfaces polished to mirror like perfection, to press gold foil until it shimmered. Even the pigments came from metal: lapis blue from crushed azurite, rich reds from iron oxide, greens from verdigris scraped off copper vats. The most luxurious books featured treasure bindings with silver clasps and enameled plaques, each a collaboration between monk and metalsmith. In the Winchester Bible, tiny iron hinges allowed heavy covers to swing open without tearing the vellum, proving that beauty and function were inseparable. What's often overlooked is how these artisans blurred the line between workshop and artist studio. Take the Gloucester candlestick, a masterpiece of 12th century metalwork. At first glance, it's pure devotion, biblical figures swirling around the stem. But examine the base, and you'll spot the smith's inside joke: a mischievous demon gnawing on the stem, his face echoing the grotesques found in cathedral gargoyles. This playful duality defined medieval aesthetics: sacred and profane, strength and delicacy, all coexisting in hammered metal. Even everyday objects carried this artistry. A simple key from Burgundy might terminate in a lover's knot, while a merchant-scale beam bore etched constellations, reminders that utility never had to mean austerity. Now shift your gaze eastward to the Silk Road, where Persian smiths elevated metal to poetry. Their tilework knives had blades so finely engraved with calligraphy they resembled manuscript pages. In Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, entire walls shimmer with kundan, filigree gold wires thinner than threads, woven into lace like patterns by smiths using magnifying lenses. And in Kyoto, the crafting of a samurai's tsuba sword guard became a spiritual discipline, with smiths meditating for days before hammering designs of cranes or cherry blossoms into the steel. Where European smiths often worked in service of the church, their Eastern counterparts fused craft with philosophy, creating objects meant to elevate the soul as much as serve the hand. Yet for all these differences, one truth united them. The greatest works emerged when smiths transcended their job descriptions. Whether forging a cathedral spine or a tea master's kettle, they proved that true artistry isn't about the material, it's about the vision. And as the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, that vision would face its greatest test yet. Across the seas, in the misty valleys of Japan, the forging of a samurai's katana was never just a craft, it was a sacrament. Before even lighting the furnace, swordsmiths underwent days of purification, fasting, donning white robes, and chanting Shinto prayers to cleanse body and spirit. The workshop itself became a sacred space with straw ropes hung to ward off impurities. Every step, from folding the steel to quenching the blade, followed rituals unchanged for centuries. Compare this to the Islamic world's legendary Damascus steel, where smiths in Syria and Persia timed their work to celestial events, believing certain phases of the moon produced stronger metal. Though separated by continents, both traditions shared an unshakable conviction that the finest blades were born not just from skill, but from spiritual harmony. The similarities ran deeper than ceremony. Japanese Tamahagane steel and Damascus's Wootz ingots both relied on astonishingly advanced metallurgy for their time. In Japan, smiths layered high-carbon and low-carbon steel like the folds of an origami, creating a blade that could be razor-sharp yet resilient. Meanwhile, Middle Eastern smiths mastered the art of crucible steel, melting iron with precise amounts of carbon and trace elements from Indian mines to produce distinctive swirling patterns, each one as unique as a fingerprint. These weren't just aesthetic flourishes. The crystalline structure of Damascus steel made it nearly unbreakable, while the katana's differential hardening gave it that legendary curve. Two cultures, two techniques, yet both achieved the same impossible balance. A sword that could slice through armor yet flex like a willow branch, but the contrasts were just as revealing. Where Japanese smiths guarded their methods with clan-like secrecy, Damascus techniques spread along trade routes from Toledo to Tibet. Persian workshops openly stamped their blades with praise to Allah, while katana signatures often bore poetic names like Moonbeam or Crimson Lotus. Even their failures told a story. A flawed katana might be ritually broken over the smith's knee, its shards buried at a shrine, a Damascus blade with impurities. Melted down without ceremony, waste was simply raw material awaiting rebirth. The true marvel lies in how these traditions influenced each other. When Mongol invasions brought Damascus sabers to Japan's shores, local smiths adapted their folding techniques to mimic the watery patterns of Islamic steel. Centuries later, European crusaders encountering Damascus blades would call them serpent swords, believing their wavy designs were the marks of Eden's guardian. This cross-pollination wasn't limited to weapons. Japanese tea ceremony kettles borrowed the thin-walled elegance of Persian copperware, while Middle Eastern astrolabes incorporated the precise gearwork of Chinese smiths. Metal, it seemed, was the original universal language, yet for all their shared brilliance, nature dealt each tradition a different hand. Japanese smiths battled humidity that threatened their forges with rust, while desert-dwelling Damascus makers prayed for rare rains to cool their work. One culture revered the cherry blossom's fleeting beauty in their engravings, the other immortalized the eternal in geometric arabesques. These weren't just stylistic choices, they were reflections of how land and climate shaped philosophy at the anvil. And as we're about to discover, the earth itself would become the blacksmith's silent partner, offering treasures and challenges in equal measure. Beneath the clash of swords and the rise of castles lay an invisible force shaping medieval destiny geology. The rocks beneath a kingdom's feet could determine its wealth, its wars, and even its survival. Take Sweden's Dannemora mines, where iron ore so pure it seemed to bleed from the earth turned a modest Scandinavian kingdom into a geopolitical heavyweight. Lords and emperors schemed to control these subterranean treasures, not just for weapons, but for the nails that held ships together, the plows that fed armies, and the coins that paid them. Iron wasn't just a metal, it was the skeleton of empire. Consider the strategic chessboard of medieval Europe. When the Holy Roman Empire annexed the Erzgebirge Mountains, literally, ore mountains, they weren't just claiming territory, they were monopolizing the continent's richest silver veins. This wasn't unique to the West. In Mali, the Bambuk goldfields bankrolled Mansa Musa's legendary Hajj, while Anatolia's copper deposits made it the most contested land between Crusaders and Seljuks. Even tiny regions flourished when geology favored them. The Basque country's abundant iron turned isolated villages into arms dealers for half of Christendom. The lesson was clear: whoever controlled the ore controlled the future. But extracting these riches demanded more than picks and shovels. It required blacksmiths' ingenuity. Early mining tools were laughably crude: wooden wedges soaked to swell and crack rock, stone hammers that shattered after a dozen strikes. Then came the smith's revolution. Iron-reinforced drill bits could pierce deeper veins. Treadmill-powered trip hammers, their mechanisms forged in village workshops, pulverized ore faster than 100 men with mortars. Even the humble wheelbarrow, its metal axle and iron-rimmed wheel crafted by local smiths, transformed mines from backbreaking labor into engines of wealth. The real power plays happened far from the mine shafts. When English kings slapped export taxes on raw iron, they forced Flanders to buy finished English weapons instead, a medieval version of a tech embargo. Meanwhile, Venetian merchants hoarded Dalmatian copper, knowing it was essential for bronze cannons. Some of history's most cunning deals were brokered not over gold, but over the right to smelt. The Teutonic Knights, for instance, traded Prussian amber, worth its weight in gold, for Swedish iron ingots, then resold them as sword blanks to German princes at triple the price. Yet geology's gifts came with brutal costs. The same Dannemora mines that bankrolled Sweden's armies became hellscapes where prisoners toiled in perpetual darkness, their shackles forged from the very ore they dug. In Bohemia, silver miners developed hunched backs from years of crouching in narrow tunnels, their lungs choked with metallic dust. And when resources ran dry, whole regions collapsed overnight, like the Cornish tin mines abandoned when cheaper Spanish deposits were found, leaving ghost towns where anvils once rang. The blacksmith's art began long before the forge was lit. It started in the choice of which rocks to break, which veins to follow, and which alliances to strike to keep the metal flowing. Because in the end, the medieval world wasn't just built on iron and steel. It was built on the decisions of those who knew how to wrest them from the earth. And as we turn to the tools that made this possible, remember, every hammer, every chisel, every nail began as stone waiting to be transformed. The rhythmic pounding of a blacksmith's hammer might seem timeless, but the tools behind that sound underwent a revolution as profound as any medieval battle. Picture the earliest forges' simple pits dug into the earth, where apprentices huffed at hand-pumped bellows to keep the flames alive. Then came the game changer, water wheels harnessed to massive trip hammers, their wooden arms rising and falling with mechanical precision. Suddenly, what took a smith hours of grueling labor could be done in minutes. The clang of metal wasn't just craftsmanship anymore, it was industry in its infancy. These water-powered hammers weren't just bigger versions of hand tools, they were marvels of engineering. A single wheel could drive multiple hammers, each adjusted to strike with different weights and rhythms. Heavy blows flattened ingots into sheets, while lighter taps refined sword edges or shaped delicate hinges. The smith's role shifted from brute strength to precision control, guiding the metal beneath the machine's relentless beat. Some forges even added tilt hammers, which allowed smiths to adjust the angle of each strike, perfect for curving armor plates or sculpting decorative ironwork. The result, a single workshop could produce 10 times the output, turning sleepy village smithies into bustling hubs of mass production. But the real genius lay in the details. Take the Catalan forge, a furnace design that used carefully angled tires nozzles that directed airflow to reach temperatures high enough to melt steel. Or the German bloomery method, where ore was smelted in clay chimneys that trapped impurities, yielding purer iron with less waste. These weren't just incremental improvements, they were leaps forward, each one unlocking new possibilities. A sword forged with Catalan steel held an edge longer, while bloomery iron resisted rust, making it ideal for ship nails that braved salty oceans. Yet for all their power, these machines didn't replace the smith's artistry, they amplified it. Water hammers could rough out a blade's shape, but only a master's hand could perfect the taper of a sword or the balance of an axe. The finest workshops became symphonies of man and machine, where apprentices fed glowing metal into trip hammers while veterans judged the quality of each strike by ear. The ringing tone of properly tempered steel became a language in itself, with seasoned smiths detecting flaws in the harmonics like musicians tuning an instrument. The impact rippled far beyond the forge. With trip hammers standardizing nail and hinge production, builders could erect taller cathedrals and sturdier bridges. Armies fielded more uniform weapons, reducing the luck of the draw in battle. Even agriculture transformed stronger. Cheaper plowshares meant more land could be cultivated, feeding growing cities. The blacksmith's workshop, once a solitary craft, had become the engine of an entire economy. And at the heart of it all stood the next generation, wide-eyed apprentices who pumped the bellows, hauled the ore, and dreamed of the day they'd command the hammer themselves. Their hands might blister from fetching coal or scrubbing soot from tools, but their eyes were taking in every spark, every adjustment of the anvil, every muttered curse when metal cooled too fast. These weren't just helpers, they were the living thread between tradition and innovation, ensuring that even as technology advanced, the soul of the craft endured. The journey from awkward novice to master smith wasn't measured in years. It was counted in calluses, burns, and sleepless nights. A 7-year-old boy sent to the forge didn't touch a hammer for his first 2 winters. He hauled water, swept ash, and choked back tears as blisters burst on his palms from pumping bellows. This was education medieval style, knowledge earned through exhaustion where every skill came drenched in sweat. The hierarchy was merciless. At the bottom, the coal boy scurried to keep the fire fed, praying the master wouldn't notice his shaky hands. Above him, the striker held tongs in trembling grip, learning to read the metal's color like a language, cherry red for bending, lemon yellow for welding. Only after surviving these trials might an apprentice graduate to striking his first nail, a moment so pivotal many smiths recalled the exact date decades later. Secrecy wrapped the craft like a second skin. Techniques weren't written down but whispered during midnight oilings of tools. A master might demonstrate a sword-quenching technique once, with his back turned, leaving the apprentice to replicate it through trial and scorching error. Guilds enforced these silences ruthlessly. In 14th century Toledo, an apprentice caught sketching his master's sword patterns had his right thumb severed. Yet this harshness had purpose. In a world where one superior steel recipe could make a city's fortune, knowledge was wealth too precious to spill. The real test came in the masterpiece, not some artistic showpiece, but a brutally practical challenge. For armorers, it might be crafting a helmet that could withstand 3 direct crossbow strikes. For rural smiths, forging a plowshare that turned soil without cracking after 50 acres. These weren't just tests of skill but of character. A York Guild record from 1383 describes an apprentice who passed his technical trial but failed because his nails showed haste over care, a medieval lesson that perfection mattered more than speed. Yet within this rigidity flickered moments of unexpected tenderness. Masters often became surrogate fathers, providing not just trade secrets but dowries for daughters, or intervening when apprentices got drafted into wars. The Strasbourg Guild even kept a tears ledger, noting which boys wept during their first solo forge attempts, not to shame them, but to identify those who took the work to heart. The best smiths understood that metal remembered emotion. A blade hammered in frustration would crack where one forged in focus held true. Religion sanctified this punishing path. Apprentices began each day tracing crosses in the ashes of the forge, invoking Saint Eligius's protection against burns. In Germanic lands, initiates drank from a ceremonial cup shaped like an anvil, pledging oaths to their craft as solemn as monastic vows. The most sacred rite came during quenching. As steam hissed heavenward, masters would murmur benedictions over the water tank, transforming a physical act into spiritual allegory, the purging of impurities through trial by fire. This sacred-profane duality shaped smithing's deepest paradox. To create life-giving tools, one first had to master destruction. Every hammer blow shattered old crystalline structures in the metal, forcing them to reorganize stronger. Apprentices learned that sometimes you had to ruin a piece to perfect it, snapping off a sword tip that cooled wrong, or melting down a week's work because the grain structure looked wrong under moonlight. In an age that saw suffering as divine chisel, the smith's path became the ultimate metaphor, redemption forged through fire. The glow of the forge held more than heat, it pulsed with what medieval minds believed was divine presence. Cathedrals across Europe treasured relics like Saint Eligius's hammer or the holy nail of Trier, objects said to transfer celestial skill to any smith who touched them. Before crafting a single hinge or horseshoe, artisans would press their foreheads to these sacred items, whispering prayers for steady hands and clear vision. Some workshops kept small altars in their corners, where masters would leave offerings of iron filings or the first nail of the day, tiny sacrifices to sanctify their labor. The rituals ran deeper than mere superstition. When a Norman smith etched crosses into his anvil's base or a Burgundian armorer quenched blades in water blessed by bishops, they weren't just hedging their bets. They were participating in a world where material and spiritual realms constantly intertwined. The forging process itself mirrored Christian theology, raw ore as fallen creation, fire as purifying trial, and the finished blade as redemption made tangible. Even the rhythmic hammer strikes took on liturgical significance: 3 taps for the Trinity during the folding of a sword's steel, 12 blows for the apostles when shaping a church gate's hinges. Some of the most fascinating rituals blurred the line between workshop and chapel. In Milan's cathedral foundry, smiths preparing to cast bronze doors fasted for 40 hours, mirroring Christ's wilderness trial. Welsh metalworkers timed their forging to coincide with the chanting of monks in nearby abbeys, believing harmonious sound strengthened the metal structure. And in Cologne, guild records describe spirit checks, moments when smiths would halt work to examine freshly polished steel for ghostly reflections, interpreting flashes of light as divine approval or warnings. But the supernatural wasn't always benevolent. Across Scandinavia, smiths hung rowan branches above their doors to repel malicious spirits drawn to the forge's transformative power. English folklore warned of forge imps, mischievous creatures said to warp metal if smiths grew arrogant. One Yorkshire ballad tells of a master craftsman whose finest sword kept breaking until he discovered his apprentice had skipped the traditional Friday fish fast. Only after repentance and rebelling did the blade hold true. These beliefs weren't confined to the Christian world. Islamic smiths in Al-Andalus inscribed Quranic verses into their tools, particularly the throne verse Ayat al-Kursi for protection against the evil eye. Jewish metalworkers in Prague wrapped their tongs in prayer shawl fabric during Sabbath, honoring the prohibition on labor while acknowledging their tools' sacred role. Even the Vikings attributed magical properties to smiths who worked during Alphablatt nights dedicated to appeasing elves who guarded secret metallurgical knowledge. The true testament to this spiritual dimension lies in the objects themselves. A bishop's crozier might contain filings from a saint's tomb sealed within its iron core. Crusader swords sometimes had hollow pommels holding parchment prayers, turning weapons into reliquaries. And in Byzantium, the process of making church bells involved casting them over chanting priests, embedding sound with sacred meaning before the first ring. Yet for all this reverence, smiths also knew when to bend the rules. When a Parisian guild ran out of holy water during a plague year, they substituted ale for quenching and swore the resulting tools were the finest they'd ever made. A Florentine smith's diary from 1412 recounts bribing a monk to bless an entire vat of nails at once rather than individually, grumbling that God sees efficiency as its own devotion. These pragmatic moments remind us that medieval faith was as much about lived experience as dogma. What emerges from these practices isn't just a portrait of superstition, but of profound respect for materials, for process, and for the unseen forces that might turn skill into something transcendent. The smith stood at the crossroads of the measurable and the mystical, his hammer mediating between human need and higher power. And as the clamor of approaching wars would prove, that balance was about to be tested like never before. The clang of swords against armor wasn't just a sound of battle, it was a conversation between blacksmiths across generations. When plate armor began replacing chainmail in the 14th century, it didn't just protect knights better, it rewrote the rules of warfare. Picture a charging knight encased in polished steel, his joints articulated like a mechanical marvel. Arrows that once pierced chainmail now glanced harmlessly off curved breastplates, their tips skittering away like pebbles on ice. But this innovation didn't happen in isolation. For every advance in armor, smiths on the other side were already hammering out counters crossbows with steel prods capable of punching through plate at close range, or poleaxes with hammerheads designed to dent armor and stun the wearer beneath. The battlefield became a chessboard where smiths were the unseen grandmasters, anticipating moves years in advance. One of the most fascinating adaptations was the rise of half-swording. When blades couldn't slash through plate, knights gripped their swords like daggers, using the tapered points to target gaps in armor. Armpits, visor slits, the back of the knee. This wasn't brute force, it was surgical precision, a direct response to smiths making armor too strong for traditional strikes. Meanwhile, blacksmiths working for infantry developed weapons like the misericord, a slender dagger specifically designed to slip between armor plates, proving that even the smallest adjustment in the forge could tilt the balance of life and death. But the real game changer lay in metallurgical espionage. After the Battle of Agincourt, French smiths reportedly salvaged English longbows to study their steel-reinforced tips, while Italian armorers secretly bought captured Hungarian helmets to replicate their superior tempering techniques. The most guarded secrets weren't blueprints for siege engines. They were quenching recipes and annealing times scrawled on scraps of parchment, passed down like state secrets. In some cases, smiths became prisoners of war not for ransom, but for their knowledge. A chronicle from the 100 Years' War describes an English armorer kept in a gilded cage by the Duke of Burgundy, forced to teach his techniques under threat of losing his hands. Yet for all their strategic importance, blacksmiths also became casualties of their own success. The same plate armor that made knights nearly invincible also led to their decline. Why? Because smithing it required so much time and ore that only the wealthiest nobles could afford full suits. When gunpowder weapons arrived, their iron balls could crumple plate with a single shot, rendering decades of armor innovation obsolete almost overnight. The smith's response: adapt again. They thickened breastplates into bulletproof cuirasses, tested by firing pistols at them point blank. The dents served as proof marks, a macabre quality assurance system. Now let's strip away the Hollywood myths. Contrary to popular belief, medieval smiths didn't spend hours dramatically plunging red-hot swords into water barrels. Quenching was a precise science: oil for slower cooling that kept blades flexible, brine for rapid hardening that risked brittleness, and those massive anvils. Many were surprisingly small, some no larger than a loaf of bread, because precision mattered more than brute force when shaping intricate armor contours. Even the iconic image of a smith working solo is misleading. Armoring a single knight required teams: a locksmith for articulated joints, a specialist for helmet visors, another for heat-treating greaves, each a master of their niche. The truth is, blacksmiths were the original military-industrial complex, their forges humming with innovation long before the age of factories. Every dent in a battlefield relic, every sword scar, every reforged spearhead tells a story not just of warriors, but of the unseen hands that armed them. And as we'll discover next, those hands held secrets that went far beyond mere metalwork. Hollywood loves to show knights cleaving boulders with a single swing, or swords staying razor-sharp after hacking through armor. But the truth of medieval metallurgy is far more fascinating than fiction. Those dramatic blood grooves running down the center of movie swords, they're actually called fullers, and their purpose wasn't to drain blood but to lighten the blade while maintaining strength, like the ridges in a steel beam. And while Viking sagas spoke of legendary swords like Ulfbert slicing through shields, even the finest blades would chip or snap if struck against stone. The real test of a sword wasn't brute force but balance. A well-made blade could pivot on a single finger at the crossguard, allowing precise control in the chaos of battle. Take the myth of quenching swords in human blood to make them unbreakable. While medieval smiths did experiment with quenching liquids, from urine to animal fats, blood's inconsistent temperature would create brittle, flawed steel. The secret to a resilient blade lay in patience, not gore. Hours of careful annealing, heating, and slowly cooling the metal aligned the crystalline structure, while repeated folding removed impurities. A master smith could judge the carbon content just by the sparks flying off during grinding. Long, branching streaks meant high carbon steel perfect for edges, while short, bright bursts indicated softer iron ideal for the blade's flexible core. Even the iconic image of knights clashing in endless duels misses a key reality. Swords were often secondary weapons. Surviving battle records show lances, maces, and polearms caused most casualties. Why? Because against chainmail or plate armor, a sword's edge was nearly useless. Warriors relied on thrusts to vulnerable gaps or blunt weapons to deliver concussive force through the metal. That's why blacksmiths spent as much time perfecting spearheads and warhammer faces as they did swords. A single well-made polearm could be produced in a fraction of the time it took to forge a sword, making them the true workhorses of medieval warfare. The most enduring misconception is that blacksmithing was a solitary art. In reality, crafting a single suit of plate armor required a team of specialists, one smith for the breastplate, another for articulated gauntlets, a third for heat-treating the steel. Workshops functioned like medieval assembly lines, with apprentices grinding edges, polishing surfaces, and testing each component. A knight's armor wasn't just metal, it was a collaborative masterpiece, its joints moving with less than a finger's width of tolerance. Modern recreations reveal even more surprises. When a team in Denmark rebuilt a medieval forge using period-accurate tools, they discovered something startling. Charcoal-fueled furnaces could reach temperatures high enough to produce low-grade steel, but maintaining the heat required constant teamwork. Bellows operators had to synchronize their rhythm perfectly too fast, and the fire burned out too slow, and the metal wouldn't reach critical temperature. It wasn't just strength that made a great smith, but stamina and coordination, often working 16-hour days to meet a lord's deadline. Perhaps the greatest testament to their skill lies in what survives today. After 7 centuries, the wrought iron gates of Notre Dame still swing smoothly on their hinges, their metal untouched by rust. The secret, a thin layer of molten tin applied during forging, an ancient corrosion resistance technique modern engineers still can't fully replicate. That's the real legacy of medieval metallurgy, not flashy Hollywood myths, but quiet, enduring brilliance hammered into every functional detail. Now, step inside the reconstructed forge where these age-old techniques come alive, where fire meets iron not with movie magic, but with the same sweat, science, and stubborn ingenuity that built the medieval world. The glow of a charcoal-fired forge flickers across the face of a modern metalsmith as she hammers a red-hot iron bar, not to craft a usable object, but to solve a centuries-old mystery. Across the world, historians and craftsmen are stepping into the soot-stained boots of medieval blacksmiths, using painstaking reconstructions to uncover techniques lost to time. At the heart of these experiments lies a startling revelation. What we thought we knew about medieval metalwork often crumbles under the heat of actual practice. Take the famous three-man hammer technique, long dismissed as artistic license in medieval manuscripts until a German workshop proved 3 synchronized strikers could create perfect sword blanks in half the usual time. Or the Viking sandwich method of layering different steels, which modern metallurgists initially scoffed at until electron microscopes revealed its genius. The alternating layers acted like miniature shock absorbers, preventing catastrophic fractures in battle. These time-traveling smiths face challenges their medieval counterparts would recognize instantly. When a British team attempted to recreate the Damascus steel of Crusader swords using only period-accurate tools, they spent 6 months failing to achieve the distinctive watery patterns until one smith noticed their wrought iron contained trace amounts of nickel absent in modern alloys. Sourcing ore from an abandoned Swedish mine finally unlocked the secret. Medieval steel's magic came as much from impurities as from technique. Similarly, French researchers discovered that quenching armor plates in fermented goat's milk, a practice dismissed as folklore, created a thin, corrosion-resistant layer of casein protein that outperformed modern sealants in humidity tests. Perhaps the most humbling lessons come from the body itself. A Danish experiment had professional blacksmiths work 12-hour shifts using only medieval tools and postures. Within weeks, their bodies transformed. Right arms developed 30% more muscle mass than their left, spinal discs compressed from constant bending, and their hands developed permanent grooves matching excavated skeletons. The real revelation: medieval smiths likely worked far slower than we assumed. needing frequent rests to avoid crippling injury. This reshapes our understanding of workshop output. What took a month in modern recreations may have required a full season in the Middle Ages. Yet these experiments reveal more than technical skills. They expose a medieval mindset foreign to our efficiency-obsessed age. When American smiths tried to rush the forging of a Norman-style axe head, the metal cracked along grain lines invisible to the naked eye. Only by adopting the rhythmic, almost meditative pace shown in medieval art, with deliberate pauses between hammer blows, did the steel respond correctly. The blacksmith's craft wasn't just manual labor, it was a conversation with material, requiring patience modern industry has largely forgotten. What emerges from these fiery time capsules isn't just knowledge of metal, but of humanity. The calloused hands that shaped the medieval world weren't merely strong, they were sensitive, intuitive, and deeply connected to their materials in ways we're only beginning to comprehend. As we examine the philosophical ripples of their craft, we'll discover how this relationship between hand, hammer, and hearth didn't just forge objects, it forged ways of thinking that still shape our world today. To the medieval mind, the blacksmith's forge was more than a workshop, it was a living parable. Philosophers and alchemists gazed into its flames and saw the universe in miniature, raw earth transformed by fire, base matter ascending toward perfection. This wasn't just poetic fancy, it was a framework for understanding existence itself. The same processes that turned ore into steel calcination, dissolution, coagulation, mirrored the stages of spiritual purification in mystic texts. When a smith layered iron and charcoal in a bloomery furnace, scholars likened it to the soul's journey, burning away impurities to reveal a gleaming core. Even the forge's physical layout held symbolic weight, the bellows representing divine breath, the anvil as the unshakable foundation of faith, the quenching tank a baptismal font where molten metal was reborn as something stronger. Alchemical manuscripts teem with these parallels. The famed Ripley Scroll, a 15th-century illustrated guide to the philosopher's stone, depicts a blacksmith at work beside cryptic verses about the marriage of sun and moon, code for combining metals. What modern eyes might dismiss as superstition was, in its time, cutting-edge thought. The smith's ability to alter matter defied Aristotle's doctrine of immutable elements, suggesting that with enough heat and skill, even the most stubborn materials could transcend their nature. This idea electrified medieval intellectuals. Theologians like Albertus Magnus wrote treatises comparing Christ's resurrection to the smelting process, while Persian polymath Jabir ibn Hayyan structured entire experiments around metallurgical metaphors, seeking to quench human flaws in the waters of wisdom. But the forge's philosophical resonance went deeper than allegory. Its very rhythms shaped medieval conceptions of time. Before mechanical clocks, many villages marked hours by the cadence of the smith's hammer, 3 strikes for morning prayers, 6 for midday meals. The cyclical nature of heating, hammering, and cooling mirrored agricultural seasons and liturgical calendars, reinforcing a worldview where renewal followed destruction as predictably as day followed night. Even the guild's 7-year apprenticeship system echoed the 7 ages of man, with each stage, from coal boy to master, representing a step toward enlightenment. This symbolic weight bled into art and literature. Dante's Inferno describes hell's rivers as flowing like metal in the furnace, while Chaucer's Canterbury Tales features a yeoman whose skin is tan as smithy smoke, his very body bearing the marks of transformative labor. Cathedral sculptors carved smiths alongside prophets and saints, their hammers raised like benedictions. The message was clear: shaping metal wasn't just labor, it was a sacred act, a participation in the divine work of ordering chaos. Yet the forger's greatest lesson may have been its humility. Unlike alchemists chasing gold or philosophers spinning abstract theories, smiths dealt in tangible results. A poorly tempered plowshare broke under strain. A hastily riveted hinge doomed a castle gate. Their craft insisted that true transformation required both vision and visceral engagement, a truth that would later fuel the scientific revolution. For when early modern thinkers like Galileo sought to understand nature, they didn't turn to dusty manuscripts alone. They rolled up their sleeves and experimented, heat-treating their ideas in the forge of observation. In this way, the blacksmith's anvil didn't just shape metal, it helped shape the modern mind. Long before laboratories had glass beakers and white-coated scientists, the blacksmith's forge served as the original chemistry lab, a place where trial, error, and flames unlocked secrets of the material world. Those glowing crucibles weren't just melting metal, they were testing theories. When a medieval smith mixed tin with copper to produce bronze, he wasn't following a textbook, he was pioneering alloy science through sheer observation. The same hands that hammered horseshoes also documented how trace amounts of arsenic could harden a blade, or how alternating layers of iron and steel prevented catastrophic fractures. These weren't random discoveries, they were systematic experiments recorded in soot-stained notebooks and passed down through generations like sacred texts. Consider the alchemical manuscripts that began appearing in monastery libraries. Many were essentially smithing manuals in disguise. Symbols for iron and mercury jostled alongside biblical verses, revealing how deeply craft and cosmology intertwined. A 12th century German treatise describes quenching swords in the blood of dragons, code for mineral-rich spring water that lent steel unexpected flexibility. Elsewhere, recipes for green lion and phoenix ash concealed practical metallurgy, the first referring to copper acetate used in patinas, the second to purified charcoal essential for high-temperature forging. This wasn't mysticism for its own sake. It was intellectual property protection, guild secrets veiled in allegory to deter thieves. The real breakthrough came when smiths turned observers. Italian armorer Vannoccio Biringuccio didn't just craft cannons. He meticulously logged how different cooling rates affected iron's crystal structure, an early study of material science. His 16th century Manual de la Pyrotechnia reads like a lab notebook, detailing how manganese oxide could purge impurities from molten metal, or how zinc vapors transformed copper into golden brass. These weren't lone geniuses, they were part of an unbroken chain of artisans turned researchers whose collective tinkering laid the foundations for modern chemistry. Yet their greatest contribution was methodological. The scientific revolution's hallmark hypothesis, experimentation, replication, was born at the anvil. When English smiths discovered that reheating quenched steel at precise temperatures reduced brittleness, a process we now call tempering, they didn't attribute it to magic. They tested it repeatedly, adjusting variables like heat duration and cooling mediums until patterns emerged. This empirical approach, refined over centuries, became the blueprint for later pioneers like Robert Boyle and Antoine Lavoisier. Even the iconic alchemist's furnace owed its design to blacksmiths' bloomery hearths, proof that innovation often wears a leather apron before a lab coat. So why did these proto-scientists fade from history's spotlight? The decline wasn't sudden but gradual, a casualty of industrialization's assembly lines and academia's ivory towers. As universities formalized chemistry, the smith's hands-on wisdom was dismissed as mere craft, his notebooks overshadowed by peer-reviewed journals. The very guilds that once nurtured innovation became conservative, resisting water-powered trip hammers and coke-fired furnaces that promised efficiency at the cost of tradition. By the 18th century, the forge had been relegated to folklore. Its contributions to science were written as quaint superstition, but look closer and their legacy endures. The periodic table symbols for iron, Fe from ferrum, and gold O from aurum echo the alchemical sigils smiths scratched into their ingots. Modern metallurgists still use the cementation process, layering iron with carbon to create steel practiced in medieval Damascus. Even nanotechnology's fascination with material properties at microscopic levels mirrors the smith's intuitive grasp of grain structures. The difference. Today's scientists have electron microscopes instead of calloused hands judging heat by color. Perhaps the most poetic survival lies in language. When we speak of forging ahead or striking while the iron's hot, we're not just using metaphors, we're invoking centuries of accumulated wisdom passed down through hammers and anvils. The blacksmith's workshop may have vanished from our streets, but its spirit lives on every time an engineer tests a new alloy or a researcher peers into a crucible, seeking truth amid the flames. The rhythmic clang of hand-forged iron that once defined villages and cities alike began to fade as the 18th century dawned, drowned out by the mechanical roar of steam hammers and rolling mills. Industrialization didn't just change how metal was worked, it rewrote the very soul of craftsmanship. Where a master smith might spend days perfecting a single sword, factories now stamped out uniform nails by the thousands in an hour. The water-wheel-powered trip hammers that once seemed revolutionary became quaint relics next to coal-fired blast furnaces capable of melting tons of ore at once. Yet for all its efficiency, this new world came at a profound cost, the intimate knowledge of metal that had been passed down through generations of calloused hands and keen eyes. The shift wasn't immediate. Early factories still relied on blacksmiths' expertise to keep their machines running. The same artisans who once forged armor now maintained locomotive boilers or calibrated the massive drop hammers used in shipyards. Their understanding of heat and pressure made them indispensable troubleshooters when early industrial processes faltered. In Sheffield, England, veteran blade smiths were hired to teach factory workers the secrets of tempering steel, though now their careful judgments of color and sound were reduced to standardized temperature gauges and timed intervals. The individual touch that made each medieval sword unique had no place in an age of interchangeable parts. What's often overlooked is how many engineering breakthroughs owed their success to traditional smithing knowledge. When Henry Bessemer developed his revolutionary steelmaking process in the 1850s, it was blacksmiths who recognized the critical moment to halt the air blast, when the flame's color shifted from orange to white, preventing the metal from becoming overly brittle. Similarly, the famed German silver alloy used in early electrical components was perfected not in a laboratory, but in a Saxon workshop where a smith accidentally replicated an ancient Asian formula while repairing a merchant's tea caddy. Industrialization may have mechanized production, but its foundation rested on centuries of empirical metallurgy. Yet the human toll was undeniable. Guilds that had protected artisans for generations dissolved under pressure from factory owners. Apprenticeships shortened from years to months, prioritizing speed over mastery. In Prague, archival records show the number of master smiths plummeting by 80% between 1780 and 1820. Their workshops replaced by sprawling ironworks where workers never saw a finished product, only their small, repetitive task. The romantic image of the solitary smith at his anvil gave way to rows of laborers feeding sheets of metal into stamping presses, their skills limited to operating machinery rather than shaping materials. But the story doesn't end with obsolescence. Traditional techniques found unexpected refuge in niche markets. Swiss watchmakers prized hand-forged springs for their precision. while surgical tool manufacturers sought out smiths who could work with the delicate alloys needed for scalpels and bone saws. Even the automotive industry, that icon of mass production, relied on hand-forged specialty tools well into the 20th century. And in rural areas far from coal-powered factories, village smiths endured as indispensable fixers, mending plows, fitting horseshoes, and keeping agricultural machinery running with improvised repairs. The most poignant survival came through art. As functional smithing declined, ornamental ironwork flourished. The same Parisian workshops that once produced armor for Napoleon's cavalry reinvented themselves as creators of intricate balcony railings and garden gates. In New Orleans, freed blacksmiths like Thomas Day blended African motifs with European techniques, their wrought iron verandas becoming icons of Southern architecture. This artistic renaissance proved that industrialization couldn't extinguish the human drive to shape metal with meaning. It merely redirected it. Today, the echoes of medieval smiths persist in surprising places. The Japanese art of tamahagane steelmaking, virtually unchanged since the 12th century, supplies metal for modern samurai sword restorations. Aerospace engineers consult centuries-old Damascus steel recipes when developing new alloys for jet turbines. Even 3D metal printing owes a debt to the layered forging methods smiths developed to eliminate impurities. Though the age of the village forge has passed, its legacy lives on not as nostalgia, but as a testament to the enduring power of hands-on ingenuity. As steam gives way to silicon, we're left with a paradox. The very technologies that made blacksmiths obsolete now preserve their knowledge. High-speed cameras analyze hammer strikes frame by frame, revealing why certain medieval techniques worked when no written records explain them. Spectral analysis unlocks the composition of ancient alloys, allowing historians to recreate long-lost finishes. In a final twist of irony, the internet, that great disruptor of tradition, has become the global guild hall where modern metalsmiths share techniques across continents with a keystroke, ensuring that 9 centuries of accumulated wisdom won't vanish into the furnace of progress. The glow of the forge hasn't dimmed in our collective imagination, it's simply flickered onto new screens. When Peter Jackson's camera first panned over the fiery depths of Isengard in The Lord of the Rings, audiences weren't just seeing CGI orcs hammering swords. They were witnessing a myth reborn, the blacksmith as civilization's backbone, arms dealer to both heroes and tyrants. Tolkien's dwarven forges of Moria and elven workshops of Rivendell didn't just produce props, they codified a visual language that still defines fantasy today. Every glowing anvil, every shower of sparks in Game of Thrones Qohor, where Tobho Mott gilds Valyrian steel with ripples like liquid moonlight, taps into an ancient recognition. That power isn't just wielded in battle, but forged in fire long before. Video games have turned this symbolism interactive. In the Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim, players don't just loot weapons, they smelt ores, temper blades, and unlock hidden recipes like alchemists of old. The smithing skill tree isn't just a gameplay mechanic, it's a nod to the medieval guild system where mastery meant social ascent. Even dystopian worlds like Horizon Zero Dawn root their futurism in primal metallurgy, with tribal smiths repurposing machine parts into bows and spears. These digital forges succeed because they honor a truth Hollywood often ignores. Blacksmithing wasn't about solitary genius, but problem-solving under constraints. When Assassin's Creed Valhalla forces players to trade with Frankish merchants for better steel, it echoes the real-world trade networks that once stretched from Damascus to Dublin. Yet modern portrayals aren't just nostalgia, they're reinvention. Netflix's The Witcher reimagines the smith as sage, with the armorer Vicena murmuring elder speech over molten silver to craft monster-slaying blades. It's a callback to the medieval belief that smiths straddled the seen and unseen, their craft tinged with magic. Even children's media like Disney's Tangled gets it startlingly right. The snuggly duckling thugs breaking into song about their blacksmith dreams isn't just comic relief. It's a riff on the trade's historical role as a rare path out of poverty. The real magic lies in how these fictions inspire fact. After Forged in Fire turned bladesmithing into must-watch TV, real-world apprenticeship applications spiked by 300%. Master smiths like Baltimore's Karen Smith, who crafts historical replicas for museums, now field calls from teenagers who discovered her work through God of War's Brock and Sindri. They think they're coming to learn about dwarven runes, she laughs, but they leave understanding how Viking shield rims were rolled by hand. This cross-pollination between pixel and anvil proves something profound. The blacksmith's archetype still resonates because it speaks to our hunger for tangible creation in an increasingly digital age. Perhaps the most telling detail is how often these modern myths get the small things wrong, and why it matters. Film swords are often overly ornate, with spines too thin to withstand real combat, while game forges let players craft a full suit of plate armor in minutes. Yet these inaccuracies reveal something unexpected. Even when bending reality, storytellers instinctively preserve the core truth that metalworking demanded patience, ingenuity, and respect for materials. When Game of Thrones showed Gendry's calloused hands shaping dragonglass, or Shadow of Mordor had Celebrimber whisper forgotten quenching techniques, they weren't just world-building, they were passing the hammer to a new generation, ensuring the anvil's song never fades to silence. The embers of medieval craftsmanship still glow today in workshops where modern smiths breathe life into ancient techniques. Meet Jens, a Danish bladesmith whose calloused hands mirror those of his Viking ancestors. Every morning, he stokes a charcoal forge identical to those found in 9th century Norse settlements, using iron smelted from local bog ore just as the old masters did. When I quench a blade in fermented whey instead of water, he explains, running a thumb along a freshly tempered edge, I'm not just replicating history. I'm having the same conversation with metal that my forebears did. His replicas aren't mere museum pieces, they're functional time machines, proving that a well-forged Ulfbert sword can still cleave a shield with terrifying efficiency. Across the Atlantic in Virginia, Elena's workshop tells a different story. As one of few female smiths specializing in Gothic armor, she's dismantling stereotypes with every hammer strike. People expect chainmail to be rigid, she says, flexing a sleeve of meticulously riveted rings that moves like fabric. Her pieces worn by reenactors and Hollywood stars alike reveal hidden truths about medieval life. A knight's armor wasn't a clunky prison. When tailored right, you could do cartwheels in it. Her research into women's roles in historical metalwork has uncovered forgotten guild records showing female smiths crafting everything from surgical tools to cathedral weather vanes. What unites these modern keepers of the flame isn't nostalgia, but problem-solving. In Japan, swordsmith Yoshindo Yoshihara still folds Tamahagane steel using 6th century methods, not because it's easy, but because modern alloys can't replicate the katana's unique crystalline structure. Each fold purifies the metal, he explains, showing a billet with 16,000 layers visible like tree rings. Meanwhile, in Toledo, Spain, Raphael's workshop has decoded the lost art of Damascene patterning by studying Islamic manuscripts. His recreations of Al-Andalus swords reveal how medieval smiths exploited trace elements in Indian ore to create self-sharpening micro-serrations along the blade, a nanotechnology predecessor. The appeal goes beyond function. At the College of Historical Arts in Germany, students don't just learn combat, they study the philosophy behind each weapon's design. A longsword's balance point isn't just physics, instructor Fabian explains. It's ergonomic psychology. When the weight aligns with your natural pivot, the blade becomes an extension of thought. This mindfulness echoes in places like the Czech Republic's medieval mining towns, where smiths still chant folk songs passed down through generations, melodies whose rhythms perfectly match the cadence for drawing out wrought iron. Yet preserving these skills isn't without irony. YouTube tutorials and 3D scans now archive techniques that guilds once guarded with dagger threats. We've traded secrecy for survival, laughs British smith Roger, whose viral video on forging Anglo-Saxon sixes has been viewed 2 million times. His Patreon supporters include engineers studying medieval solutions to modern metallurgical challenges, like using beech ash as a flux to eliminate weld impurities in recycled steel. As our journey through fire and time concludes, remember this: every hinge that swings smoothly, every knife that holds its edge, every bridge that bears weight owes a debt to those who first coaxed strength from stone. The blacksmith's legacy isn't frozen in museum glass. It lives in the hands of those who still hear the whispers of iron and answer with hammer strikes. So next time you turn a key or admire a wrought iron gate, pause and listen. Beneath the surface hum of modern life, the anvil's song still rings clear, a testament to human ingenuity forged in fire, tempered by time, and still shaping our world today. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil didn't just fade into history, it evolved, echoing through the centuries in ways we're only beginning to understand. That blacksmith leaning over glowing metal in a medieval village, his legacy lives on in the steel beams of skyscrapers, the precision of surgical tools, even the alloys that power space exploration. The true measure of his impact isn't just in what he made, but in how he thought, solving problems with fire and ingenuity when no blueprint existed. Consider this: every time you tap a touchscreen or swipe a credit card, you're interacting with technologies born from the same relentless curiosity that once turned raw ore into civilization's building blocks. What's astonishing is how many medieval techniques still shape our world. The Damascus steel that baffled crusaders, its layered microstructure inspires modern bulletproof vests. The Japanese art of folding tamahagane steel finds new life in aerospace engineering, where stress-resistant alloys must withstand forces medieval smiths couldn't have imagined. Even the humble nail, standardized by guilds 800 years ago, set the template for mass production that would birth the Industrial Revolution. The blacksmith's greatest invention wasn't any single tool, it was the mindset that materials could always be transformed, improved, reinvented. Yet there's poetry in how their craft endures beyond utility. In Kyoto, a swordsmith chanting Shinto prayers while folding steel connects to ancestors who armed samurai. In rural France, farriers still shape horseshoes using tongs and hammers nearly identical to those in 13th century manuscripts. These aren't just reenactors, they're keepers of tactile wisdom, proving that some skills can't be fully automated. When a modern bladesmith feels the perfect quenching temperature by the color of the glow, or senses a flaw in the steel by the ring of her hammer, she's tapping into knowledge that no textbook can capture. So the next time you pass a construction site or open a crisply engineered gadget, pause. Beneath the sleek surfaces and digital interfaces, the blacksmith spirit thrives. In the engineer tweaking carbon fiber composites, the artisan crafting bespoke bicycles, even the programmer debugging code with the same iterative patience as a smith testing alloy ratios. Our world may be built on silicon now, but its foundations rest firmly on iron and fire. This isn't just history, it's a mirror. Just as blacksmiths defined the medieval era, today's innovators are forging our future. The question isn't whether we'll remember their contributions centuries from now, but what will create worthy of being remembered. After all, the anvil song never truly ends. It just finds new metals to shape.